Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about aspects of Form 5. Just with all of the previous videos in this series, we're talking about, again, things that each of the forms add, as well as introducing concepts that you can retcon into the previous ones, as well as, again, taking a previous idea and, again, molding it to your will. So in this case, Form 5 is kind of, again, taking the ideas from Form 4, as well as adding a few things, right? So Form 4 was primarily about, again, that raw power, being able to stabilize yourself pretty quickly, as well as adding a little bit more fluidity to that power that Form 3 didn't quite have, right? Form 3 was very kind of start and stop, versus Form 4 is a lot more about, again, being able to manipulate, again, the weight of your sword, be able to move all over the place, again, also be able to gauge what's going on, right? So Form 5 actually introduces a lot more new concepts and new techniques as opposed to what Form 4 did, right? So the first thing I would like to take a look at is stabs. Now, in the old way we used to do Form 4, we did have a stab at the end, but it's no longer canonical, right? So kind of like just to show you something that was going on, right? So if we were here, we would cross-cut, and then from here, we would in fact stab someone. Or in fact, back then, it was in Teirose, and then you would cut them. However, that has now been turned into a simple defense, and then going into put away. So, Form 5 is actually the first time you really start to do stabs, at least again in the canonical sense. We actually have two different versions in this form, right? So obviously it's the beginning of the form, we're kind of going for the solar plexus, right? Right, so for here, the idea is, again, they're in defense, hence stepping in, right? So, and as you step in, right, you're trying to gently deflect their sword a little bit. Notice that my tip is still in their core, although my left hand is allowed to wander towards my hip, right? So I step, right, so using that step to, break that distance, get close enough that I could use, again, that hip motion to stab up into someone's diaphragm, right? Now the idea here is, so the best case scenario, at least in terms of being able to dispatch, right, is be able to come up underneath the rib cage and again get all the goodies in there, right? So ideally hitting the pulmonary artery, something like that, right? So something good on the inside near the core. Second best option is that if you actually hit a little bit higher up, even if you hit the sternum, that powerful thrust is going to be able to push them back enough so that you can actually go in with a better strike. Now that said, so why do the stab in the first place if the main idea is to finish them off with something else, right? So if we're here, right, so again I'm deflected, I broke his distance, I am too close for him to cut me, him or her, right? But I can actually make contact with the tip of my sword against their sternum, and from here I can just push, I can use my whole body to push that person away. Right? So again, that breaks their distance, they're not really expecting it, they're being pushed back, and then it can be finished. Now, what happens in this form is a little bit different, right? But we'll come into that because that's our second point. But yeah, so a third option for that stab, and this is not necessarily what's going on in the form, but again, if it's too low, it goes into obviously the diaphragm, middle, it hits the chest. Obviously, if you scrape up, you can maybe get, one of the jugulars, right? So if we're here, I make contact, I'm still trying to push up, I can slide one way or the other, most likely this way, just because it's using the hip. I could slide up, maybe even along there if they are wearing a gorget, maybe even be able to catch underneath it, or maybe even pops up and be able to hit beneath the helmet if they are wearing a helmet. Be able to cut in that way, right? So all sorts of things you can do with this fun stab, right? Now I mentioned there's two, right? And that's at the very end, right? So you just shoulder rolled over something, right? And then you're here and you thrust. So notice the difference in this thrust, right? So the first couple were all upright, right? Really trying to either get underneath chest or jugular. This time it's horizontal, right? So again, you might wonder, why is this horizontal? Why does Gumdo use horizontal stabs? Well, the idea is you want to be able to slide between the ribs, right? So this is assuming, obviously, if they're not wearing armor, right? Now, if they are wearing armor, there is something else you can do. But from here, right? So if I'm able to puncture someone's diaphragm, right? So not diaphragm, but rib, right? Use the rest of the form. Sink your hip back, draw it out of the body, pop up, and then you can finish, put away. Now that said, you can still use this thrust even if the person is armored. For the same reason we were talking about with the higher thrusts. If I want to stab high, I can actually be able to maybe hit the side of the neck, something like that, right? So this would also be a good way to ward off someone, just because this is actually harder to manipulate than this, right? So that's why actually if you're in, middle guard versus middle guard, it's very easy to manipulate the other person, versus someone's horizontal guard is a little bit harder, which is a running theory that I have for Yeto 1, but whole different thing. But regardless, so here are, again, this is a new concept introduced in Form 5. Another concept that's been introduced in Form 5 is the idea of a parry. Now, technically, there is also a parry in Form 4, at least the way that I interpret, again, that block, right? But this is a lot more like this is the point of it, right? Because this can also be interpreted as blocking a crosscut. This, I am manipulating someone else's sword, be able to throw it off into a corner, right? So if we're both in defense, the idea is I would probably come down, across, and up in that nice, almost circular motion. We're really using that left hand to parry, right? So again, if they're in so sword versus sword, they get parried off. If they're offline, I can go in for that thrust, right? Now that said, this also happens the other way. Right, so parrying is something that's going to be very, very useful. It's really best instantiated in Form 7 with the curling, what I call the 7 parry or the J parry, because it makes a slightly J shape, right? That's probably the best block you can do. But obviously, if you're able to do this one effectively, it's going to be doing pretty well, right? And that said, there are other ideas you can have with this particular combination, right? So the idea is actually, I'm trying to stab you. I know you're going to try to deflect me. I'm going around your sword and around your sword to stab. But that's going to be a slightly different, again, more my idea of what's going on, as opposed to something that is more canonical, right? So according to the Federation, we do a lot more of the actual parries. And the third thing that I would like to leave you with, so obviously these are not like all inclusive, right? There's going to be many, many new ideas that we can still talk about. But the third one that I'd like to leave you with is, in fact, interacting with the people that you just attacked, right? So in the first sense, right, so again, the idea is I'm clearing you off, right, and I'm actually interacting with that person's sword. I'm trying to actually get that sword out of the way every single time. Again, I might, parry and try to do, get my distance and then start running up against someone, right? But especially near the end, right? So I want to think about the application of the end. Right, so the idea is someone is running up behind me, trying to murder me to death, right? So I'm going to come in, jump, and as I make contact, cut. So it's going to be a nice high cut, just hitting something. And as they're either falling or I hit their sword, I'm going to switch deeper, trying to cut them as they're falling, right? And as they're falling even further, like hitting the ground, I'm going to shoulder roll over that person, right? So this gives you, again, a new perspective, right? Because in the battlefield, there will actually be the formerly living opponents, right? So there'll be one on the ground as you're finishing here. You want to be able to stab that person without just going like, yeah, right? So you're going to shoulder roll over it to get some momentum and thrust, right? So again, these are all sorts of new ideas that you can have. But this is something that I would like for you to think about as you go through your own form, right? Because there's going to be more obstacles as you go. Now, let's take the idea and retcon, right? So I mean, all of these ideas allegedly can be interacting with all sorts of different levels. Let's take it back 2 forms, right? So let's take a look at that idea in Form 3. The idea is like, all right, so you ever think it was kind of weird that we did that double step back? Right? So at the end of Form 3, you kind of do the kind of like check, 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 right? Like attempting a very bad moonwalk. What are you doing, right? So obviously one interpretation is someone's trying to come at me, I'm trying to bait them in, to do something silly. But one idea, and this is actually more or less confirmed by Master Kim as far as I know, unless if I misinterpreted, is you're actually just checking behind you, right? So if you think about like the geometry of form 3, so let's just say we just finished here and we just did the 3 left. So for homework, think about what pieces of the floor you saw as you went through the form, and you'll notice that that piece we didn't see, right? So in the rest of the form, like so for example at the beginning I'm here, and mostly I'm kind of understanding this area, and then I'm moving back this way. I don't know what's going on there, right? I haven't been very conscious of it. So while I'm backing away from this person, right, who might be making death saves, right? So you're gonna be checking, right? So making sure, check with your foot, check, right? So that's one interpretation that again, Master Kim, so Grandmaster Kim mentioned, at least in passing. And it's just an idea that's, is appropriate, right? So an idea that's really, really concentrated in Form 5 is also going to be true in Form 3. So it's this kind of thing that I want you to kind of, again, think about, and also take these ideas and just play with them, like play with them to extremes, right? So try to take different applications, try to see, again, if something that works in Form 5 works in Form 2, or something like that, and you'll find out more often than not that it will. So I guess with that, drills to consider, right? So obviously, contemplate, again, those stabs, right? So practice those with a partner. For now, again, if this is the first time you're doing it, probably wear chest protection, throat guard, maybe a mask, as well as, again, the pad swords. But again, try to figure out like how the sensation is to actually do a proper thrust, right? So again, for us, it's going to be mostly just hitting the lower part of the dome, right? So the dome of the chest. We'll be hitting here just because we don't really want to hit each other's face, right? But the idea behind is like, all right, let me just see what happens when I use a little more hip. Let me see what happens when I use a little more of my chest. Let me see what happens when I use a little more left hand to really push that, the tip deeper into the solar plexus, right? So again, play with those ideas. Play with a horizontal thrust, which might be a little bit different because we have a circular safety sword, so it doesn't really matter. But then again, take the ideas that we're working on today and extrapolate them to all the other forms. So with that, keep training, stay safe, and stay humble. Haidong!